The morning mist clung to the Vatican gardens like an unspoken prayer, wrapping around the ancient olive trees and marble fountains in ghostly embrace. Pope Leo XIV walked the narrow gravel path alone, his white cassock dampened by the pre-dawn moisture, his breath visible in small puffs that dissipated into the gray air. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft crunch of stone beneath his worn black shoes and the distant murmur of Rome. Awakening beyond the walls, he paused beside the fountain of St. Joseph, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the water's gentle cascade. For 6 months now, the weight had grown heavier each morning. Pressing against his chest like a stone, he could neither swallow nor spit out. The name that haunted his sleep, that echoed in the corridors of his mind during every meeting, every prayer, every moment of attempted peace. Luis Antonio Tagle. Leo's fingers unconsciously worried the simple wooden cross beneath his cassock. A gift from his seminary days that he had never removed, the media speculation had reached a fever pitch in recent weeks. Journalists from Manila to Madrid asking the same question in different languages. What was the true relationship between the Pope and the Cardinal, whom many believed should have been elected instead? The truth sat in his throat like a confession too dangerous to speak. A soft footstep on the path behind him made Leo turn slightly. Monsignor Alvarez approached with the cautious reverence of a man who understood when his presence was necessary, but unwelcome. He carried a silver tray with a single cup of coffee and a folded newspaper, both steaming slightly in the cool air. "Your Holiness," Alvarez said quietly, setting the tray on the fountain's edge. "The Secretary of State has requested a private audience this morning. He says it's regarding the Manila situation." Leo's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The Manila situation. As if reducing it to bureaucratic terminology could somehow make it manageable. "Tell Cardinal Bellucci I will see him after Lauds," Leo said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had made a decision he wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. Alvarez bowed and retreated, leaving Leo alone with the mist and the weight of words that had remained unspoken for far too long. He picked up the coffee cup, feeling its warmth against his palms, and whispered a name into the silence that seemed to echo off the garden walls like a prayer seeking its destination. Luis. The evening shadows stretched long across the PayPal. Pope Leo XIV sat behind the ornate wooden desk that had served 7 pontiffs before him, his fingers steepled, watching as his Secretary of State arranged a stack of newspapers and printed articles with the precision of a prosecutor laying out evidence. "The situation has escalated beyond our ability to contain it through silence," Bellucci said, his Italian accent clipping each word with bureaucratic efficiency. He slid a copy of La Repubblica across the polished surface. "Manila's Archbishop Emeritus has been photographed 17 times this month alone, each image accompanied by speculation about why the Holy Father refuses to speak his name in public, noting how they moved with calculated deliberation, never trembling, never uncertain. These were the hands of a man who had never doubted his path, never questioned whether his certainties might be chains. Cardinal Tagle has made no public statements," Leo said quietly. "He continues his pastoral work with the same humility he has always shown." "Precisely the problem." Bellucci leaned forward, his voice dropping to the tone he reserved for matters of institutional survival. "His silence appears noble, while yours appears ... troubled. The faithful begin to wonder what secrets require such careful guarding." The word secrets hung in the air like incense, heavy and persistent. Leo turned his gaze to the window, where St. Peter's dome was barely visible against the darkening sky. Somewhere beyond those walls, in a modest residence in Manila, Luis Antonio was likely preparing for evening prayer, unaware that his very existence had become a political liability. "The consistory meets next month," Bellucci continued, his tone growing more insistent. "Several cardinals have privately expressed concern about the ambiguity surrounding your relationship with Cardinal Tagle. They suggest that clarity would serve the Church's unity." Leo's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the wooden cross beneath his cassock. And what form would this clarity take? A simple statement, an acknowledgement of his contributions to the Church, followed by a clear delineation of appropriate boundaries. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would embarrass anyone involved. Bellucci's smile was thin, political, merely ... pastoral guidance. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Leo understood the subtext perfectly. Speak now on our terms, or risk having the truth emerge on someone else's. I will consider your counsel, Leo said finally, his voice carrying a weight that made Bellucci's confident posture falter slightly. After the Secretary of State departed, Leo remained at his desk, staring at the newspapers scattered across its surface like accusations waiting to be answered. The rain drummed against the windows of Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle's modest residence with the persistence of whispered prayers, each droplet carrying the weight of Manila's humid evening into the small chapel where he knelt before a simple wooden crucifix. The sound masked the soft footsteps of Sister Maria as she entered, her weathered hands carrying a tray of untouched dinner and a stack of international newspapers she wished she didn't have to show him. "Your Eminence," she said gently, setting the tray on a side table, "the children from San Lorenzo Parish are asking when you'll visit again. Little Carmen drew you another picture." Tagle smiled without turning from the crucifix, his shoulders carrying a weariness that had settled there like dust over recent months. "Tell them Sunday, after the morning Mass. I promise to hear their confessions, though I suspect they'll have more to forgive me than I them." Sister Maria's silence spoke louder than words. She had served as his confidant for 15 years, long enough to recognize when his gentle humor masked deeper pain. She placed the newspapers beside the tray, their headlines visible in multiple languages, all asking variations of the same question that had haunted their household for months. "They're saying he won't speak your name," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The reporters came again today. They want to know why Pope Leo XIV seems to avoid mentioning you in his audiences." Tagle's fingers tightened around his rosary beads, worn smooth by decades of prayer. He had seen the photographs they spoke of, images of himself walking through the streets of Tondo, visiting the sick, blessing children, each one accompanied by speculation about why the man who had once been his closest friend now seemed to treat his very existence as a diplomatic complication. "Roberto carries burdens I cannot imagine," Tagle said, using the Pope's given name as he always had, refusing to let titles create distance where friendship once flourished. "If my presence in the world makes his cross heavier, then perhaps, no." Sister Maria's voice carried an authority that surprised them both. "You will not disappear to make others comfortable with their own discomfort." Outside, the rain intensified, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang the evening hour. Tagle rose slowly from the kneeler, his knees protesting after too long in prayer. He walked to the window and watched the water cascade down the glass, each stream like a tear the city shed for sorrows it couldn't name. "He was different when we were young," Tagle said to his reflection, less afraid of what people would think. If they knew how deeply he felt things, Sister Maria gathered the newspapers without opening them. Some truths, she had learned, were too heavy to carry into sleep. The Papal Chapel held midnight like a secret, its votive candles casting dancing shadows across the ancient stones as Pope Leo XIV knelt before the tabernacle. Sleep had abandoned him again, driven away by Bellucci's words and the weight of decisions that felt increasingly like betrayals. His hands moved automatically through the familiar prayers, but his heart wandered to places his mind had forbidden it to go. It was while reaching for his breviary that his fingers brushed against the small wooden box tucked behind the prayer books, a container he had not opened in 3 years. Inside, beneath a faded photograph of his ordination and his mother's rosary, lay an envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in his own younger handwriting to Father Luis Antonio Tagle, spiritual director, Ateneo de Manila University. Leo's breath caught as he lifted the letter, remembering the night he had written it in 2003, when he was still Bishop Roberto Prevo of a small diocese in Ohio. And Luis was the priest who had changed his understanding of what it meant to serve God with an open heart. The paper crackled as he unfolded it, his eyes moving across words that had once felt essential enough to write, but too vulnerable to send. "My dear Luis, I write this knowing I lack the courage to mail it, but perhaps putting these words on paper will help me understand what happened to me during our retreat. You spoke of prayer as falling in love with God's love for us, and something broke open in me that I didn't know was closed. For 43 years, I have served the church with my mind and my discipline, but never with the abandon you described, the way a child runs toward a father's arms, certain of being caught. Leo's hands trembled as he read his younger self's confession. You pray like someone who has never doubted that God delights in you. And watching you, I realized how much of my priesthood has been built on earning worthiness rather than receiving it as gift. When you laughed during the Eucharistic prayer actually, laughed with joy, wept. Because I had forgotten that God might want our happiness more than our perfection, the candle flame flickered as Leo reached the letter's end. I fear that my admiration for your freedom has become something I dare not name, even to myself. Not love in the way the world would corrupt it, but something deeper. The recognition that in you I see the priest I was called to be, but was too afraid to become. Forgive me if this friendship has become a burden to you. Perhaps it is better if we maintain the distance that our positions require. Leo folded the letter carefully, his chest tight with the memory of the young bishop who had been brave enough to recognize grace, but too frightened to trust it. 21 years later, elevated to the chair of Peter, he found himself still running from the same truth that had terrified him then. That Luis Antonio Tagle possessed something he had always lacked: the ability to love God without reservation. Chapel clock chimed midnight, and Leo whispered into the silence, "What have I become, Luis? What have I let them make me become?" The Vatican press room hummed with the restless energy of journalists who sensed blood in the water. Monsignor Francesco Toretti adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and surveyed the sea of raised hands, cameras, and recording devices that awaited his morning briefing like hungry predators. In the back corner, Cardinal Robert Serra sat motionless, his dark eyes observing the proceedings with the stillness of a man who understood that some storms could not be weathered, only endured. Monsignor Toretti called Maria Santos from Agence France Presse, her voice cutting through the murmur of preparation. It's been 6 months since Pope Leo XIV has publicly mentioned Cardinal Tagle by name. Despite the Cardinal's continued prominence in the Asian Church, can you explain this apparent silence? Toretti's practiced smile flickered almost imperceptibly. His Holiness mentions many cardinals in various contexts. I'm not sure the premise of your question reflects with respect, interrupted James Morrison from Reuters. Our analysis shows that Cardinal Tagle, who was previously mentioned in 17 papal addresses last year, has been referenced 0 times in 2024. This seems deliberately significant. The room stirred with the anticipation of journalists sensing a crack in the Vatican's usually impenetrable facade. Cardinal Serra shifted slightly in his chair, his weathered hands folded over his breviary as he watched Toretti navigate waters that had grown increasingly treacherous in recent weeks. The Holy Father's speaking schedule addresses the needs of the Universal Church, Toretti replied, his tone growing more mechanical. Cardinals serve in various capacities, and public mention is not an indicator of, is it true, pressed Alina Rodriguez from El País, that Cardinal Bellucci has advised the Pope to create distance from Cardinal Tagle following rumors about their past relationship. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and persistent. Toretti's pause lasted 2 seconds too long. Lifetime in the Vatican's carefully choreographed dance of information management, the Holy Father receives counsel from many sources and makes his own decisions regarding all matters of church governance, Toretti said finally, but his voice carried the strain of a man defending a position he wasn't sure he believed. Cardinal Serra rose quietly from his seat, his movement causing several journalists to turn their cameras toward him. He offered no words, no gesture, simply walked to the exit with the dignity of a man who had seen enough. His departure spoke louder than any official statement could have managed. In the silence that followed, Maria Santos asked the question that would dominate headlines within the hour. Monsignor, is Pope Leo XIV planning to address the Tagle situation directly, or will the Vatican continue to let speculation fill the void? Toretti closed his briefing folder with a sound like a door shutting. No further questions today. But the questions, Cardinal Serra knew as he walked the corridors toward the papal apartments, had already multiplied beyond containment. The vastness of St. Peter's Basilica swallowed Pope Leo XIV's footsteps as he made his way toward the altar. In the pre-dawn darkness, seeking refuge from the storm of questions that had followed him from the press briefing, the ancient stones held centuries of prayer within their silence, and Leo felt the weight of that accumulated faith pressing against his chest like a physical presence. Above him, Michelangelo's dome disappeared into shadows that seemed to breathe. With the rhythm of his own troubled heart, he knelt before the Blessed Sacrament, his white cassock pooling around him like spilled light in the darkness. The sanctuary lamp flickered with steady devotion, its red glow the only color in a world rendered in shades of gray and gold by the filtered moonlight. Streaming through the basilica's towering windows, "Show me what you want," his voice barely disturbing the sacred stillness. "I cannot continue carrying this burden without knowing your will." It began as a warmth against Leo's chest, where the wooden cross rested beneath his cassock. Not painful, but insistent, like sunlight focused through glass. He opened his eyes and gasped softly. The sanctuary lamp's flame had changed. The steady red glow of sanctuary oil, but a brilliant white light that pulsed with the rhythm of a heartbeat. As Leo watched, transfixed, a second light appeared beside the first, identical in brightness and rhythm, pulsing in perfect synchronization, as if two hearts had found their shared tempo. The lights danced together for what felt like eternity, but lasted perhaps 30 seconds before returning to their normal red glow. "Holy Father," Sergeant Brenner's voice carried across the basilica, cautious but concerned. He had seen the lights too, his weathered face pale in the moonlight as he approached the altar. "Rail, Your Holiness, did you, ... was that?" Leo remained kneeling, his eyes fixed on the sanctuary lamp that now burned with ordinary flame. But the message had been clear, written in light across the darkness of his doubt. Two hearts, beating as one, two flames, sharing the same sacred fire. Sergeant Leo said quietly, his voice carrying a new certainty that surprised them both. "What time is it in Manila?" Brenner checked his watch, still shaken by what he had witnessed. "Nearly 1:00 in the afternoon, Your Holiness." Leo closed his eyes, seeing in his mind's eye Luis Antonio kneeling in his own chapel, perhaps before his own sanctuary lamp, carrying the same burden of unspoken truth. The lights had shown him what he had always known, but been too afraid to acknowledge. Some bonds transcended politics, geography, even fear. "Thank you," Leo whispered to the darkness, though whether to God or to Luis, he could not say. In the papal study, Pope Leo XIV sat at the antique desk where Napoleon had once signed treaties, his hand hovering over the secure telephone that could reach any corner of the Catholic world within seconds. The afternoon light filtered through heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet as he stared at the handwritten phone number he had memorized 20 years ago, but never dared to dial since his election, 12 time zones away. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle stood in his simple Manila residence, his own hand resting on the black receiver of a telephone that had remained silent for too many months. The humid afternoon air stirred the curtains of his modest study, where a framed photograph of his ordination, Pope Leo XIV, visible in the background as a young bishop watched from the bookshelf like a witness to promises once made. Leo's fingers traced the numbers in the air above the keypad, muscle memory guiding movements he had imagined 1,000 times. "Roberto calling Luis," he would say, as if titles and protocol could simply fall away with the spoken intimacy of given names. His chest tightened with the memory of easier conversations, late-night discussions about theology, and doubt that had shaped both their vocations in ways neither had fully understood at the time. In Manila, Tagle's hand lifted the receiver halfway to his ear before setting it down again with the gentleness of a man placing a sleeping child. He had rehearsed the words countless times. "Holy Father, it's Luis. I wanted you to know that whatever silence you need to maintain, I understand." But understanding and accepting were different territories, and his heart had not yet learned. To navigate the distance between them, Leo closed his eyes and saw the two lights from the sanctuary lamp, pulsing in perfect rhythm. The sign had been clear, but clarity and courage were cousins that rarely visited at the same time. He picked up the receiver, heard the dial tone's steady hum, and began to press the first digit of the international code. Simultaneously, 8,000 miles away, a sequence of digits that represented not just geographical distance, but the chasm that institutional fear had carved between. Receivers in hand, hearts beating with the synchronicity that had once made their friendship feel like divine providence. Both heard their own, breathing echo in the earpiece, heavy with words that remained trapped in hearts too afraid to risk the vulnerability that speaking truth demands. Outside Leo's window, the bells of St. Peter's began to chime vespers. In Manila, the same hour brought the call to evening prayer. Neither man heard the bells. They were listening to the echo of a conversation that had almost happened. The Paul VI audience hall buzzed with the excited whispers of 300 Filipino children, their voices creating a symphony of innocence that seemed to lift the curved ceiling toward heaven. Pope Leo XIV adjusted his white succedo as he prepared for what should have been a routine audience. Miles' blessings, perhaps a few questions about their studies and their faith. The children sat in neat rows, their dark eyes bright with anticipation, some clutching handmade drawings and others fingering rosaries. Their grandmothers had pressed into their small hands before the journey to Rome. Leo had specifically requested that no other dignitaries attend this audience. He needed the simplicity that only children could provide. Their unguarded hearts a refuge from the political calculations that had consumed his recent days. But as he stepped onto the dais, his almost hidden among the supervising teachers and chaperones, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird, "Holy Father," called a small voice. From the front row, cutting through his distraction, her hair braided with yellow ribbons that caught the afternoon light. "My name is Maria Luz, and I have a question." Leo smiled, despite the turmoil churning in his chest. "Ask me anything, little one." Maria Luz tilted her head with the directness that only children possess. "My teacher's sister Carmen says that Cardinal Tagle used to be your friend, but now you don't talk about him anymore. Did you have a fight? Because my mama says when friends fight, they should say sorry and be friends again." The silence that followed was absolute. 300 children held their breath, sensing without understanding that something significant hung in the air. Leo's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white beneath his PayPal ring. In the back of the hall, Tagle's head was bowed, his shoulders rigid with the weight of a question that had just shattered every carefully constructed wall of protocol and institutional discretion. "Maria Luz," Leo said, his voice barely steady. "Sometimes grown-ups make things more complicated than they need to be." "But were you friends?" she persisted, her innocent eyes reflecting a truth that cut deeper than any journalist's inquiry. "Because you look sad when I say his name, and Cardinal Tagle looks sad too." Leo's gaze found Tagle again across the hall, and this time neither man looked away. 20 years of shared prayer, mutual respect, and unexpressed affection hung between them like a bridge neither had dared to cross. In that moment, surrounded by the pure hearts of children who understood friendship in ways that politics had taught them to forget, Leo felt something crack open in his chest. Pope Leo XIV sat at his desk, the 21-year-old letter, his fountain pen poised over words that had not yet found their courage. The events in the audience hall had shattered something in him, not his resolve, but his fear. Maria Luz's innocent question had become a divine imperative he could no longer ignore. Monsignor Alvarez entered with the morning's briefings, his footsteps hesitant as he approached the desk. He had been Leo's secretary long enough to understand the significance of documents that emerged from hidden places. "Your Holiness," Alvarez said carefully, "Cardinal Bellucci has requested an urgent meeting." Leo looked up from the letter, his eyes carrying a clarity that hadn't been there in months. "Tell the Cardinal I will see him at 10 o'clock. Within the hour, Cardinal Robert Serra arrived, his austere presence filling the study with the gravity of a man who... He glanced at the letter on the desk, then at Leo's face, and understood without explanation that a decision had crystallized in the night. "You're going to speak publicly," Serra said, settling into the chair across from the PayPal desk. "In front of 300 children and their teachers, she asked why I look sad when I mention his name, and I realized that my silence has become a lie." Serra leaned forward, his dark eyes intent. "The Curia will resist. Bellucci will paint this as weakness, a surrender to media pressure. Let them." Leo's voice carried a quiet strength that seemed to surprise even him. "I have spent 3 years trying to protect the institution by sacrificing the truth. But what good is a church built on the fear of love? The world will speculate about the nature of your friendship. Then let them speculate about love instead of secrets." Leo picked up his pen and began to write, his handwriting steady despite the magnitude of what he was committing to paper. "I will not let politics poison what grace created." Each word a small act of rebellion against the machinery of institutional preservation. Outside, Rome awakened to another day of speculation and whispers. unaware that in the papal study, truth was finally finding its voice. When, Sarah asked quietly, Leo set down his pen and looked at the completed statement. Today, at the noon Angelus, the world has waited long enough for honesty. The study fell silent, except for the scratch of fountain pen on paper, as Leo signed his name with the deliberate precision of a man stepping across a threshold he could never cross again. St. Peter's Square shimmered under the Roman noon sun. They were about to witness the most unexpected papal address in decades. Pope Leo XIV stepped onto the balcony of the Apostolic Palace. His white cassock brilliant against the ancient stone, his face bearing the serene gravity of a man who had finally chosen truth over safety. Cardinal Bellucci stood in the shadows. Behind him, his jaw rigid with the knowledge that his careful damage control had been swept away by papal determination. The Secretary of State had tried one final time to dissuade Leo, warning of scandal, institutional damage, media speculation. But Leo had simply smiled and said, "The truth is never scandalous, Eminence, only our fear of it." In Manila, Cardinal Tagle sat in his chapel, drawn by an inexplicable urge to pray at precisely this hour, the device crackling with static as Leo's voice carried across the ocean on invisible waves. "Dear brothers and sisters," Leo began, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal, "today I speak to you not from prepared remarks, but from the heart of a man who has learned that silence, when it protects fear rather than love, becomes its own betrayal." The crowd stirred slightly, sensing something unprecedented in the Pope's tone. Journalists pulled out phones and recording devices, their instincts sharpened by the unexpected gravity in his words. "Yesterday, a child asked me if Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle and I were friends," Leo continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Her innocent question revealed to me the poverty of my own courage. I have allowed months to pass in silence, not to protect the Church, but to protect myself from admitting a beautiful truth." In Manila, Tagle's hands tightened around his rosary. He was my spiritual director, my confessor, my guide in learning to love God without reservation. He taught me that holiness is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to trust despite it. He showed me what it means to serve with joy rather than duty. The square fell into absolute silence, 30,000 people holding their breath as the Bishop of Rome spoke words that shattered every assumption about papal isolation and institutional distance. "I have hidden this friendship not because it was wrong, but because I feared that the world would see my dependence on his wisdom as weakness, my love for his holiness as something to be questioned rather than celebrated." Leo paused, looking out over the sea of upturned faces. "But love, Evan, the love between spiritual fathers and sons, is never weakness. It is the very foundation upon which Christ built his Church, his friend's voice speaking truth across the world." Within minutes of Pope Leo XIV's words echoing across St. Peter's Square, the world began to fracture into 1,000 different reactions, each person processing the unprecedented papal revelation through the lens of their own understanding of love, friendship, and institutional power. In the Vatican press room, Monsignor Toretti stared at his phone as notifications exploded across social media platforms. Pope reveals spiritual father relationship trending globally within 6 minutes, followed by analysis pieces that ranged from celebration to condemnation. His hands trembled slightly as he prepared for the briefing that would inevitably follow, knowing that no amount of diplomatic language could contain what Leo had unleashed. Cardinal Bellucci stood frozen in the Apostolic Palace corridor, carefully constructed world of protocol and control, crumbling around him like ancient parchment. "Spiritual director," he muttered to himself, the words tasting like ash. "He's made himself vulnerable to every critic, every enemy of the Church." Yet even as he spoke, something in the Secretary of State's chest loosened a recognition that truth, however inconvenient, carried its own authority in Manila. Cardinal Tagle remained in his chapel, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Leo's public affirmation. Sister Maria found him there an hour later, still clutching his rosary, tears having given way to a profound stillness. "Your Eminence," she said softly, "the phones haven't stopped ringing." Journalists gathering outside, Tagle looked up at her with eyes that seemed to have aged years in minutes. "Roberto," he whispered, using the Pope's given name as if it were a prayer. Across the globe, reactions multiplied like ripples in disturbed water. In Chicago, an elderly priest wept as he remembered his own spiritual director from seminary, understanding for the first time why some friendships feel like sacraments. In Sao Paulo, a young seminarian felt his chest expand with hope, recognizing that even the Pope needed guidance in learning to love God more deeply. Cardinal Sarah, watching from his apartment window as media trucks surrounded the Vatican walls, smiled quietly to himself. He had seen this moment coming in Leo's eyes during their dawn conversation, the inevitable collision between institutional fear and spiritual authenticity that could only be resolved through surrender to truth. But it was in a small village, church in Ireland, that perhaps the most profound reaction occurred. Father Michael O'Brien, celebrating evening Mass, found himself spontaneously adding words to the prayer of the faithful. For Pope Leo XIV and Cardinal Tagle, that their friendship may remind us all that love is the foundation of faith, not its complication. The congregation's amen rose like incense, carrying across continents the recognition that some truths, once spoken, transform not just the speaker, but everyone who hears them by sunset in Rome. The world had split in two: those who saw Leo's revelation as weakness and those who recognized it as the most powerful act of papal authority in decades, the authority to be human in service of the divine. The morning mist clung to the Vatican gardens with the same gentle persistence as 3 weeks before. But the weight that had pressed against Pope Leo XIV's chest like a stone had transformed into something lighter, not absence, but presence. He walked a familiar gravel path beside Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, their white and red cassocks creating a quiet harmony against the ancient olive trees that had witnessed centuries of papal struggles and resolutions. The silence between them was no longer the heavy quiet of unspoken burdens, but the comfortable stillness of friends who had rediscovered the rhythm of shared prayer. Tagle had arrived in Rome 2 days earlier, his first visit to the Vatican since Leo's election, carrying with him the worn leather breviary that had once belonged to their mutual seminary prefectura, gift he had always intended to give, but never found the courage to offer. "The fountain sounds different," Tagle observed, as they approached the water feature where Leo had spent so many solitary mornings wrestling with decisions that now seemed impossibly complicated. From their earliest conversations, when titles were suggestions rather than barriers, Leo smiled, feeling muscles in his face relax in ways they hadn't in months. Or perhaps I'm finally hearing it properly. He paused beside the stone basin, watching the water cascade with the same gentle persistence it had maintained through papal reigns and revolutions. "I read your letter," he said quietly. Tagle's eyes held steady warmth. "It took me 6 drafts to write something that sounded like friendship rather than diplomacy. You thanked me for my courage." Leo's voice carried wonder, as if the concept still surprised him. "But it was your silence that taught me the difference between wisdom and cowardice. You never asked me to speak. You've simply continued being who you've always been, a man who loves God without reservation." They walked deeper into the gardens, past the grotto where so many popes had sought solitude in times of crisis, that danced with Mediterranean breezes, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to celebrate rather than conceal. "Maria Luz wrote to me," Tagle said, his eyes sparkling with the memory. "She wanted to know if we were friends again. I told her we had never stopped being friends, we had simply forgotten how to show it." Leo stopped walking and turned to face his spiritual father, his friend, his brother in ways that transcended the red hats and white cassocks they wore. "I want to ask your forgiveness, Luis, not as Pope to Cardinal, but as Roberto to the man who taught him to pray with his whole heart." Tagle's response was not words, but embrace, the kind of reconciliation that speaks in silence and understands that some truths are too large for language. In the distance, the bells of St. Peter's began to chime, calling the faithful to morning prayer, but neither man moved. They had found what they had been seeking all along, the courage to love without fear.